It is architecture, and it is the palace, and it is the grounds, and it is everything that the monarch did. But I think, above all, it's the story. If the monarch makes a palace and never lives there, then it's not really, to me, such a fascinating building.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. If walls could talk, what secrets would the walls of a British royal palace whisper? Well, murder, debauchery, treason, and scandal, according to a new book by Professor Kate Williams. Speaking to Kev Lochun for today's podcast, Kate reveals why Queen Victoria hated Buckingham Palace, how monarchs always know where they're going to die, and what the future holds for these beloved buildings as the royal family continues to evolve.
Welcome to this episode of the History Extra podcast. I'm joined today by Professor Kate Williams, and we're talking about Kate's new book, The Royal Palaces, Secrets and Scandals. Kate, welcome. It's great to have you on the show.
Welcome. Good to see you.
Your book, it lists 30 royal palaces. Some of those are big names you expect: Buckingham, Hampton Court, Holyrood House. Some are perhaps less familiar, and some have ceased to exist. What can royal palaces, as in buildings just of themselves, tell us about the story of monarchs and the monarchy?
Everything about royalty is centred on their palace. From the earliest times, the leaders, the chiefs, wanted the bigger houses, the royal palaces, signifying from the very earliest times that this is the significant member of the community. And so the idea that the royal has the biggest, the largest, the most palaces, and the idea that these palaces act as CEO of royalty, they are HQ, monarchy HQ, is really what we see from the earliest of times. So in terms of what the palace does, it's totally reflective of what the monarchy, or the monarch himself or herself, thinks that the monarchy should do. So you have Henry VIII with his public states for jousting, and you have right through to Elizabeth II with a cinema in Buckingham Palace. So what the monarch thinks is the role of monarchy, whether or not it's being public sport or whether or not it's being engaged with film, with television, with what the monarchy and what other parts of the world look like on film. That's really encapsulated in the palace. And it is incredible how many palaces we still have in the UK, but also how many that we've lost. I'm heartbroken that we don't have Greenwich anymore. It must be, the thought of having Greenwich Palace to look through, and the fact that Whitehall, we've only got, a few tiny little bits of Whitehall left. And I think they are where monarchy played. They are where monarchy lived. They are where monarchy ruled. They are where monarchy made the decisions that changed the lives of all the ordinary people that in these palaces, the decisions, the political cabals, the networks, the marriages were made, which totally changed everything about ordinary people's lives. And also in them, what you also see is the states in which the ordinary people were allowed, were permitted, were encouraged to interact with the monarchy. How much was that possible? How much was it not possible? How much was the palace a place where people could visit and mill around, and how much was it a fortress that you were never allowed to go? So they're like going behind the scenes in a movie set. They are the show set for monarchy, and they are the frames for it. How do they make monarchy look the best? And every generation of monarchy have different ideas about how they should use a building or how they should use a room to best show off their monarchy brilliance, as it were.
So one thing I want to jump in on is this idea between the palace and the perception of the monarch. And I just wonder if there's a distinction there between a palace a monarch builds him or herself versus one they kind of inherit.
I think there's an absolute distinction between a palace that a monarch builds for him or herself, or a palace that he or she inherits and either puts up with or rebuilds. You see over and over again, the British monarchy don't tend to like the palaces that they get from their predecessors, even if they are their mothers and fathers. Most of them really don't like them at all. For example, Victoria absolutely hates Brighton Pavilion that she inherits from her uncle George IV, and think it's very strange and very weird and very unsuitable for what she wants to do, which is show herself as this sort of version of a middle-class monarch with a family home. So she trundles off and she buys Isle of Wight and she buys Balmoral. And when monarchs come to the throne, they start passionately rebuilding and building palaces. So Henry VIII, the keen stealer and builder of other people's houses, and takes Hampton Court and makes Whitehall into his pleasure palace. And then Charles II comes and makes Whitehall into his huge party palace. It's always such a pleasure to me that monarchs don't always have the money to do what they want to do, because the majority of them just want to knock down every palace that there was before, knock it down and start all the whole thing all over again. It's like when people without planning permission might knock down a lovely little country thatched cottage and build a great big glass greenhousey thing on top and then sell it 2 years later. William and Mary, when they come in, they buy Kensington Palace because the air in London isn't good for William's asthma, but they also want to use Hampton Court because it's lovely in the countryside. And they don't really like all the Henry VIII stuff, and they're going to knock it all down and make it all nice and make it turn of the century. And then they realise they haven't got enough money. Thank goodness for the fact that William III hadn't got any money, because otherwise we'd have lost all the beauties of Hampton Courts.
One thing I was surprised about as well was to find your book included castles, and I think in a modern context we can think of them quite differently. But I guess that's more reflective of, in their times, they were the form they needed to be, even though they perform the same function.
Yes, I think that the earliest palaces were forts. We wouldn't use the word palaces for them, but they were the equivalent to the buildings that are used to display the greatness of the ruler, the chief, the leader. And then we move into castles. William the Conqueror comes, and after 1066 he enthusiastically builds castles and fortresses. So it is a sort of transition that you have in terms of where monarchy lives, from a sort of hill fort and a mound right through to the castle. And then as monarchy moves into a state where the challenges are abroad as opposed to within, and they need less, it's less likely that they need to live in a fortress, so they sort of live in increasingly great big houses. And when, of course, Victoria buys Balmoral, it's not because she wants a fortress, it's not because she wants a place that she can be protected, it's because she wants to have a Scottish Disneyland. She wants the whole Scottish experience, and covered with tartan and covered with thistles, and makes it this sort of Scottish fantasia.
So are we saying there that the evolution of the palace as we see it is kind of a reflection of almost domestic security for the monarch?
I think that's absolutely right. I think the evolution of the palace is a growth of domestic security. In the earliest times, the monarch is showing their power, they're showing their greatness, and that inheres in their ability to protect themselves. There inheres in their ability not to be deposed by invaders, external or internal. And as we move on to a state in which, of course, monarchy is always there to be thrown off its throne, but it tends to be done in a more peaceful fashion. At least we know the rise of the bloodless coup in which monarchy is chucked out when James II is swiftly deposed by William and Mary, by his daughter and her husband. William does come with an army, but there's no need for an actual battle against the king. He flees, he leaves the palaces, and William and Mary have got everything. As monarchy changes from a warrior monarchy to one that makes decisions about how the country is won, to one that is symbolic, the palaces change with them. So we have the warrior palaces, then we have the Stuart period, in which the monarch is making clear decisions about people's lives that are cataclysmic, and the palaces there become sites of power, and the court is a site of power, and the networks of the court displayed by the palace, whether it's jousting, whether it's balls, whether it's receptions, these what seem like externally fun are actually ways in which power is cemented. And then when we move into the monarchy becoming constitutional or symbolic, the palace becomes a display case. And I think we see that very much with Victoria. She hates Buckingham Palace. She thinks it's the most drafty and horrible place, and the sewers smell, and you don't know, the windows are never clean. So she wants her own symbolic pretend palace, pretend Scotland, and she wants the Isle of Wight. And it is fascinating, isn't it, how Buckingham Palace is seen as a symbol of the monarchy. Every monarch, every royal occasion has Buckingham Palace as the backdrop. When we report on royal occasions, there's Buckingham Palace behind us, and it is sort of the stand-in for monarchy. And yet it's a very young palace. It was bought by George III, and it greatly extended by George IV. There even was the possibility we never would have had it after the Houses of Parliament burnt down. William IV said, well, why don't you use this? This is a nice building. Why can't you have this as the Houses of Parliament? So that really fascinates me as a what if, that But Buckingham Palace might not have been monarchy HQ, but it is also so effective because it really encapsulates the monarchy that we have, which is a constitutional symbolic monarchy. It's about the balcony wave, it's about the drives past the palace, it's about how the monarchy looks and appears as opposed to what they actually do and what they actually decree.
The right symbol for the right time is what I'm taking from what you're saying now. I just wondered what you thought of the idea that maybe Buckingham Palace is less a symbol of monarchy but more of a symbol of Elizabeth II.
Buckingham Palace is totally the symbol of Elizabeth II, and I wonder how easy it is to dislodge. It became so associated with her throughout her life, even though it was one that she never particularly loved. She moved there as a child with her father when she was 10 and didn't particularly like it then. It wasn't a house that children would necessarily love. And then as a young married woman, they moved again from Clarence House where they were. They redecorated it to Buckingham Palace when she became Queen at an unexpectedly young age. That's what she felt. And so Buckingham Palace was never necessarily her favourite, but it was one that she really did show as monarchy HQ in a very significant way. And it really did become the backdrop for royal occasions because Elizabeth II really was the monarch of television. And if we say that, looking at our female monarchs, that Elizabeth I was the monarch of portraiture, and I think one of the greatest monarchs of portraiture across the board, better than any other monarch, is the way that she used portraiture. And Victoria was photography, and then Elizabeth II was television. The way in which Elizabeth II went from a monarch who was a little dubious about the thought of televising the coronation in 1953 to one who used television very effectively in good times and bad to speak to the nation. And I think it's very significant that we discovered quite recently that in the 1980s, the government did actually write a speech for the Queen to give in the event of nuclear war, in the event of a nuclear weapon hurtling towards the United Kingdom, and the prospect that the government judged about 30 million people would die, that they thought, and I think they were right, that people would turn on the television and the Queen would address them about the dark times people were going through. So the Queen really became this monarch of television, and in a very effective way that she uses Buckingham Palace as a backdrop for everything from royal funerals to royal weddings to celebrations to jubilees. And, we saw the Platinum Jubilee with a corgi and a bone suspended in bright lights and drones above the palace. And the palace, the palace itself seems to explode in sort of fireworks. And the palace, even Buckingham Palace, became part of the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony when you have the whole story about James Bond popping in and the idea that the Queen goes out in a helicopter and jumps over the Olympic Stadium. So Buckingham Palace, which was not anything that the Queen would buy for herself or choose for herself, became her symbolic palace. And I think it is very hard to dislodge. There is that great association with her that is incredibly strong. She was a child there. She was an adult there. She was a monarch there. And when it came to Elizabeth II's passing, or that she passed in Scotland in Balmoral, but it was never going to be the case that the great commemorations would be around Balmoral. It was always going to be the case that she would be, yes, it was in Westminster Abbey, but also in Buckingham Palace, that would be the backdrop for so many of the conversations about her passing.
You said that Elizabeth II didn't particularly love Buckingham Palace. Victoria didn't particularly love Buckingham Palace. How do you feel about it? Do you like it? Do you feel like it deserves its iconic status?
I think Buckingham Palace is one of those, like a lot of, this is probably going to get me into some trouble for saying this, but I think quite a lot of Georgian buildings, and Buckingham Palace is one of them, sometimes look a bit better from the outside than they do on the inside. And I think that the Buckingham Palace is like, it's like going on the Universal Studios movie tour. It doesn't really look real anymore. It's like a big, fantastic facade. But I think inside, it's never been loved by the ones who live there. They find it too drafty. They find it impossible to manage. Yeah, Victoria absolutely hated it, and she felt that it was obviously quite insecure. Out of all the palaces, Buckingham Palace is the one that does tend to get broken into the most. It does have what I think people have come to expect of a palace, that it is a great building which stands in isolation. And that wasn't really how a lot of the palaces were in the past. They were either walled around or there were houses around them. And Whitehall Palace was surrounded by houses of various courtiers and various people, and there were people bustling in and out. And that's not really how we see a palace. We want a palace to sort of stand in splendid isolation.
What's really been striking me as you've been telling me all these wonderful stories is that, the palace is a place of work. It's a place of, but it's also a place of rest. It's a place of play. Historically, it's politics. There's also murder. There's various unsavory things going on as well. But it doesn't sound like there's a whole lot of work-life balance. And I just wonder, how were palaces constructed to kind of allow a monarch to move through these various phases of what they needed to be to different people?
I think that's a good point. Maybe you could say that the monarchs were the original WFHs, the original work from homers, because your palace is both your home and it is also your workplace, and it is also the place in which the networks of who's in power and the networks of who makes decisions are created and sustained by the various social setups of the palace. So it's not one you can escape. And it is very true that monarchs themselves are always trying to escape the palace. I always like the fact that in Louis XIV in Versailles, who creates this stringent social setup in Versailles, it's incredibly strict about what you can do and who can speak to who, and the levels of etiquette are punishing. And yet he himself always likes to escape to his own little country house in the grounds of Versailles, where he can be informal. And you always see monarchs who are expected to be at the top of the tree of this social setup. Some of them like the strictness, some of them don't. Some of them like the fact that they impose strictness on others, and some of them don't. But they all want to escape and get away from it all to little hunting lodges or Balmoral for Victoria, or for the Queen, also Balmoral and Windsor as well. And it's fascinating, I think, that royal life, which is the royal court, which is suffocating and stultifying, and it's it's not a life in which you don't have any money when you're living in the court. It's a gilded cage, but it is a cage, and it is a sort of Game of Thrones of who's in power, of who's not. Though people are always trying to escape it, and it's actually almost impossible to escape unless you are the monarch themselves. Everyone else has to live within those boundaries.
I was going to ask you what your favourite palace was, but I thought it was a bit on the nose. So what I'd really love to know is which royal palace has the most gruesome history?
Oh, that is a good one. Well, obviously the Tower sees the most executions. If you're in the Tower, if you're put in the Tower, you know what's going to happen to you next. It's pretty inevitable that you're going to get that head chopped off. But we exclude that one, and we exclude the fact that you are very likely to probably, if you don't have a tolerance for alcohol, you'll most likely die of alcoholic poisoning if you go anywhere near Whitehall or Hampton Court. The most gruesome palace, I think, has to be St James's Palace, and that's because we see the most murderous moment there, which is in 1810. Duke of Cumberland, Ernest Duke of Cumberland, who lives in St James's Palace, and he's the son of George III, the adult son of George III, the brother of future George IV, and he wakes up shouting, "I'm murdered," and he says someone's been bashing him over a sabre, and then the sabre hits his leg as well, and he shouts, "I'm murdered," and his valet comes to see what's going on, and they find the other valet in his room, and his throat is cut, and apparently it's cut right through to the back, the spinal cord, and there's blood all over the room. There's blood in the basin. So the valet has been killed, and is it possibly a suicide? What's going on? But he's definitely dead. The valet is dead in a pool of blood, and the Duke of Cumberland's been hit over the head and surrounded by all this panic. And so it looks to the outsiders that the Duke of Cumberland has been attempted murder, and then the valet ran away and killed himself. But when it comes to an inquest, people start saying, I don't know about this. How could someone kill themselves and cut right through to the back? And how come the razor wasn't by his hand? So it becomes a sort of terrible true crime place. And what is also quite fascinating is the fact that people are allowed in if they pay a small sum to go and have a look around the murder place. So obviously royals have found throughout history that opening up the palaces do bring in the money, but you tend not to happen as they open up palaces in the aftermath of a terrible murder. So that is pretty gruesome, and I don't think myself that the Duke of Cumberland is as innocent as he pretends about the death of the valet, it all seems very suspicious to me. And I think about, what if that happened now? If we had a sort of minor royal whose servant was found dead, in a very bloody way in a room just along from him, and then the royal said he'd been beaten up and tried to be murdered himself. I mean, it would never be out of the papers. We'd be talking about it for years and years and years, and every true crime podcast would be about this murder. Another gruesome palace is Lochleven Castle, and that is where Mary Queen of Scots is imprisoned after her battle against her brother fails. He takes her to Edinburgh, but she's too popular with the ordinary people, so they take her off to Lochleven Castle, which they see as basically being in the middle of nowhere. The idea that palaces are fortresses, that palaces are where the monarch is safe, is palaces where the only places where the monarch can be safe. That's what the vision is of these grand, great forts up on a hill, which are surrounded by guards. And yet, Mary Queen of Scots' story shows that totally different, especially if you're a female monarch. When she's in Holyrood House, the men break in and they seize her secretary David Rizzio and threaten her with death as well. They wave a gun at her, and she's very pregnant at the time and she's totally terrified, and then she's taken prisoner in Holyrood. She later does escape, and then she's captured and taken back by one of her former friends to his castle, which she actually gave to him, and then he sexually assaults her and forces that really compels her to marry him. And after that, she's battling against her brother for power, and the battle fails. She's taken to Edinburgh. They're pretty much going to put her in Edinburgh Castle, but then she's too popular with the ordinary people, so they take her off to Lochleven Castle, and there, in this castle in the middle of nowhere, that's what they see it as, the middle of nowhere. She had a very painful miscarriage, and then pretty much straight away after, she's told she had to abdicate the throne of Scotland, and a knife point. She's pretty much told that if you don't, you're going to die. So you have a situation where a monarch her palace is totally invaded. It becomes a prison. And then, she's threatened at knife point that she had to abdicate. What is so fascinating is the idea that palaces are safe, but they can be some of the most unsafe places in all ways. Sometimes, in the sense of Mary Queen of Scots, physically threatened, but also they are very unsafe in terms of the sort of palace leaks. If you were just thinking about the monarch and their political status and their status as a monarch inside, and they are full of leaks, they are full of spies, they are full of people watching and talking, and you're always watched and discussed and under the microscope. So palaces are not sort of where a monarch had to perform being a monarch, but it's not a safe place, it's not a refuge. So it's often so interesting that monarchs try and find somewhere else to be a refuge and build another house or build a small house, or all they want is a small house. I love it that Queen Charlotte, who of course has Buckingham Palace, she has all these fantastic palaces, but all she wants is her own little thatched cottage in the grounds of Kew. I just think it's so funny that they have these huge palaces and huge amounts of money, but they just want to say, I just want to be an ordinary person, live like a peasant and have my own little peasant house with a thatched cottage and thatched roof, and that's how I want to be. Because being a monarch in a palace is a world in which is one in which you are sort of a royal robot. That's what you have to be. So we see all these stories in palaces. There's adultery, there's murders, there's plot, there's power. Everything that monarchy does is in a palace. And nowadays monarchs aren't born in a palace anymore. That tradition was broken, and they are now born in a hospital. So it isn't. You don't always know where your children were born. But I do find it interesting that monarchs, unlike most people, they know where they're going to die. Most of us don't know where we'll die in terms of a place, but monarchs know where they're going to die, and they will die in one of their palaces, one of their homes that they've always loved. They will die there.
One gruesome story, which I took from the book, the one that I really kind of got under my skin, but isn't gory at all, is Kew Palace and George III. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, because that struck me as like a scene of torture, but not in a medieval down in the dungeon way.
When George III starts to really succumb to mental distress, Kew Palace is seen as an effective way of really hiding him away from the court and public view. Kew Palace, that was really intended as a summer spot, as a place again for the royals to get away from the formality of the court. And that's really where they decide that the best way to keep George away from public view, because if you have him in public view, people will start to say he's not fit to be king, and he has been upsetting and offending people in the court. So you put him in Kew Palace, and this is the vision. So you might say it might look like an idea of being kind to the king, that it is somewhere that's a more calming environment, somewhere that's a more secluded environment, that he can focus on getting well and not be surrounded by the stresses and panics and difficulties of royal life. But what you have really is George being kept in a prison. You have George being kept in a prison in a very brutal way of treating mental illness. So the way of treating mental illness at the time was very brutal. People are thrown into an asylum and treated in a very cruel way, and they're not that distinct from the king. So you have really the king is in Kew, and he's put, it's almost a bit like Mad Woman in the Attic, really. He's put in the upper stories of Kew Palace, and the royal family themselves, the Queen and her daughters, are downstairs, and that's where the king lives, and that's where the king, he is very restricted, and his doctor makes very restrictive demands on him. If he doesn't behave, he gets the straitjacket put on him, which the king hates, and if he doesn't behave, he can't use knives and forks at dinner, and he can't see his family, and it's a very he's locked in these very small rooms, and the straitjacket is put upon him and treated in a way that it was seen as terribly modern at the time, but is very cruel. Really, it does become a prison for him. And I mean, the jury's out on this. There are lots of different theories, but I mean, I don't think it actually cures his mental distress whatsoever. I think that his mental distress comes and goes, and it just goes naturally. And this is linked to the doctor's theories and practices, but I don't think that it really does happen that way.
The whole thing makes my skin crawl. And we talked about earlier the gilded cage. This is the cage without the gilding.
This is the cage without the gilding. And he does try to escape. He does try to run off into Kew Gardens and escape, and he's dragged back. He knows he's being imprisoned, and it doesn't stop him from growing very ill. And by the end of his life, he has a combination of dementia and mental illness, which is a brutal, brutal combination. And he's really very ill, and it doesn't cure him, it doesn't help him, it doesn't support him. He lives in fear. He lives in fear of falling foul of what his doctor wants, and lives in fear of having the straitjacket put on him.
We did talk about how, Palace is a place of play as much of work. If we were able to be there, which would the most fun palace be?
I think perhaps the palace that saw the most wild parties was Whitehall. There's Hampton Court, which has these great parties. There's Greenwich, that has these great jousts and celebrations. But really, number one has to be Whitehall, the palace that we no longer have. I mean, I'd like to imagine that it was burnt down because everyone was having so much fun that they burnt it down with a firework. But it was burnt down by a poor, unfortunate maid who was drying some sheets. In the Restoration, when Charles II comes back to the throne, he turns Whitehall into the party palace. The Earl of Rochester, John Wilmot, writes the most wild poetry about what goes on, and he's Lord of the Bedchamber. He knows everything about what's going on. And Charles II actually does up St James's Park. He makes it much more beautiful. He tries to bring in a Venetian gondola. He buys all these plants and trees from all over the world at huge expense. And Rochester writes this poem around Ramble in St James's Park saying, well, Charles II, you've tried to make it all perfect, but all that's going on is everyone's having assignations in there. One of the favourite places where you would meet a new friend, if you wanted to make a new friend and carry on that friendship in the bushes, was exactly where Buckingham Palace is now. Whitehall was the palace for wild parties, for celebrations, for excitements. There was fighting, there was arguing, there was total drunkenness. John Evelyn went to see Charles, and he couldn't believe that they were all gambling for huge amounts on a Sunday. But Whitehall Palace was a palace, really, where it was one all-night rave for those of them in the court. And if you didn't keep up with that, then you really were out of power. It was tough. I wonder sometimes whether some people there weren't more going through the motions of gambling huge amounts and celebrating just because they knew that's what they had to do to stay in power. And what I also love about Whitehall is that Charles II has a potion lab in the palace that he uses to make skull medicine. And if someone's had a brutal death, that's a skull you want, because if you use drops of distilled skull, then it'll be very good for you and you might extend your life. I don't think it actually ever works, but Charles gets very into making skull medicine. So that is the wild party palace.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said then, that Charles He wanted skulls that had suffered violent deaths.
Yes. Yes, ideally hanging. I think Freud would have a bit of a field day on that a man who comes to the throne after his own father has been brutally executed and suffered that kind of violent death, then he starts as a king. When he becomes more and more aware of his own mortality, he starts to make skull medicine out of the skulls of other people who suffered violent death, usually people who'd been executed or hanged for crimes. That, I think, is so fascinating. We often talk about how Charles II dealt with the horrific death of his father by being very merciful, by being the Restoration King, by saying he wasn't going to execute anyone or treat anyone badly. Apart from the men he saw as killers of his father, who he was going to really make sure that they were punished, everyone else in general life, he wasn't going to execute, he wasn't going to punish, he was the tolerant monarch. And at the same time, I think we've got this underlying compulsion that he has to make skull medicine out of skulls. You've got friends sometimes who, when you have a cold or something, they say, "Oh, this is what you need to do. You need to take this," and you're like, "Oh, it's not going to work," but you do it anyway. Or they always, lots of people have got their own ideas of remedies, and I think Charles II was always rather pressing skull medicine on people, and it never worked. But they probably, because he was king, said, "Oh yes, thank you so much. I'm feeling so much better now. How small, how marvelous."
How about for his raves? Did he make potions for those?
I think they just stuck to alcohol. They just stuck to the alcohol and the revels and the fun for those. Yes, but you needed 5 pounds of human skull, 2 pounds of antler of a male deer, and some ivory, and then various other things. And he puts it all in, and then he shakes it all up, and he calls it the King's Drop. And it's thought of for good for all kinds of things, and even thought of as a truth drug. So it's really Charles II's magic drug, and it just doesn't work at all. But I think the fact is that he thinks it's a really good truth drug, because people say, "Oh gosh, now I'm taking your drug," and I absolutely must tell the truth all the time now. So they have to say that it works, because when you're a king, you have to say that everything you do is great. Which is why I think sometimes some of the decor at the palaces is a bit strange, because no one's going to say, "Actually, this isn't so good," and certainly no one can say that your king's drops don't work.
On that point, I mean, Kate, you've been to all of these palaces, and many more, of course, that aren't in the book. What, in your view, makes a good palace? On what turns it gaudy?
And that's a really good question. What makes a good palace? And it is architecture, and it is the palace, and it is the grounds, and it is everything that the monarch did. But I think above all, it's the story. If the monarch makes a palace and never lives there, then it's not really, to me, such a fascinating building. It might be a beautiful building, but if it's never seen the monarch's personality expressed through the house, then I think it's not a successful palace. So I like the ones where the monarchs live, and the monarchs make decisions, and the monarchs make decisions that change people's lives, often not for the better. And these are the palaces that I think are the most exciting. The palace where the big moments are taking the big moments of monarchy, whereby if you could go back and say, no, don't do that. So you could say, the big moments in, say, Greenwich Palace on the May Day jousts, when Henry hears the news that one of the men accused of having adultery with Anne Boleyn has confessed, and he hears the news and leaves Anne Boleyn alone watching the jousts on the May Day jousts. And that's the moment where I just think, if I had a spaceship, I could just go back and say, "Anne, make a run for it now, run to France, just to somehow dress up as a laundress and just make a total run for it, because it's not going to end well." So where you see these great moments of royal history and great moments which impact on human history, those to me are the really great palaces. And what if I had to have one myself, if I had to own a palace myself? Well, I do love Balmoral because I love Scotland, and I do love Conway Castle because I am Welsh. But I think it might have to be, if the government said to me, "You can have any palace you want just because you're Kate," and I said, "That's great, thanks," I would have Hampton Court. I think I'd have that on. That would be mine. But I'd have to keep it open to the public because we all love it so much.
One palace I did want to talk about, Haven, is one of the lost palaces, non-such palace, and its name has this almost fairy tale quality to it. And I think because it doesn't exist anymore, it retains a bit of that air of mystery. But what's the story behind that one?
I love the forgotten palaces. They really appeal to my sense of romance. I love a ruin. I absolutely love a ruin. One of my favourite palaces is Linlithgow in Scotland, which is ruined, and it's just the most majestic, thrilling ruin. And I just imagine Mary Queen of Scots there. I love Whitehall. I love the idea that that Whitehall is gone. And I like to imagine what it would be like now if Whitehall was still there. And I do think it's very fitting that the Cabinet Office is on the place of Henry VIII's cockfighting pit. Nonsuch is another one of Henry's palaces, and Nonsuch, I think, is a very significant one. Henry VIII wanted a huge building project. It was going to be a giant building. Roads, had to be rerouted to create the Great Park. So the whole thing was rebuilt, and it wasn't even ready. It wasn't even built when Henry VIII died. But what's so interesting is that Henry VIII was so proud of it and was so obsessed by it, and yet Mary I didn't think much of it and sold it off, and it goes back to royal hands. But no one really likes it. I think no one really wants to use it. And then parliamentarian supporters have it, and then Charles II, who likes a palace, who likes a party palace, who likes a wild place to have fun, gives it to his favourite mistress, and she sells off the bricks just to pay off a huge gambling debt. It's very much a story of the vainglory of monarchs. I think the story of Nonsuch really encapsulates in sort of extremis the life of all palaces, because even if they are built and grand and become these grand locations, the grand exclusive locations only for the court, where only the very elite get to go and the ordinary people have to be servants, one day they are either knocked down or burnt down, or they are really given back to the nation as places we can all go and enjoy.
We've talked a lot about Henry VIII and his palaces. He's clearly a prolific palace builder, but does anyone match him in terms of his scale and his ambition?
I do have to say that when we look at the history of palaces and the history of monarchy, it tends to be the men who are the big palace builders, and a lot of the female monarchs tend to really to accept what they have and rebuild and renovate what they have, with the exception of Victoria, of course, who buys 2 new ones. In terms of the architectural history, the big moments, the big changes, the big alterations are made by the wealthiest male monarchs. And you can really see who, as a male monarch, feels he is the most powerful, the most unstoppable in terms of how he expresses himself through his palace. So Henry VIII, who sees himself as the archetype of ultimate power and wants to show that, is the greatest palace builder. And then Charles II is another huge palace builder who comes to the throne and says, I want some big fun palaces. I mean, you can see Charles II obviously has a bit of a problem, because most of the palaces have been either occupied by the parliamentarians as bases or given to supporters, or just fallen into rack and ruin over the time of the Commonwealth. So there is a reason why Charles II has to rebuild all his palaces, but perhaps not to the degree that he does. And then, of course, you have George IV, who's another great, who extends, builds huge palaces, is seen as the palace builder, and he's the one who makes Buckingham Palace what it is now. And it always is amusing to me to think that Buckingham Palace was bought as a little private house for Queen Charlotte. It was only meant to be a sort of little sort of retirement place for her, and now it's this gigantic, huge building.
Kate, you've chosen 30 royal palaces for this book. I'm very curious, what would be palace number 31?
Well, when you do a book like this, it's always what you have to leave out that pains you. It got to be Carnarvon Castle that I didn't include, with the incredible history that it has, and also itself used as a royal symbol, with the investiture of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales being used as this sort of image and symbol of monarchy. The whole setup by the Earl of Snowdon was TV friendly. I just love the fact that Charles wore a made up Prince of Wales crown, because the real crown had been swiped by Edward VIII when he abdicated, and he ran off with it, and they didn't really want to ask for it back. So they kind of made up a crown for Prince Charles, and on top was a little ball, and it looked very beautiful, but it actually was a ping pong ball painted gold. So you have a situation where Charles is wearing a ping pong ball painted gold, invested as Prince of Wales in a TV-friendly setup in Carnarvon Castle, and that to me is, you have a fort moving to that. It's just the image of how monarchy doesn't defend itself by leading into battle anymore, or by waving the sword at the front of the troops. It defends itself by providing TV spectacle.
What do you think is the future for these historic buildings? And particularly, I wonder, now we're in a post-Elizabethan world, and discussions about the future of monarchy, they've just become that little bit louder. Do you think how we're going to have to consider these buildings is going to change?
I think we probably will go into a transition where more of the royal palaces are open to the public for more of the year, and there may be at some point consideration about perhaps handing them all to historic royal palaces and them taking on more of the royal palaces Because if the vision of the monarchy is of a slimmed down monarchy, and they don't perhaps need so many palaces, they don't need so many buildings, if we are, as it seems to be the case, if we are going to see very many countries breaking away from having Britain as head of state, we may see a movement away from the Commonwealth. This kind of creates a smaller zone of interest for the monarchy, and therefore, do we need all these palaces to have all these state visits and state occasions? If the monarchy becomes smaller, they won't need them. I think that what we do in the United Kingdom is we follow the European model, but very much later. So the European model brought in the idea that women could inherit the throne in the same equality. It was birth order, not sex, that was about inheriting the throne. They brought it in very much earlier than we did in 2013, and we got there eventually. The European monarchy has a system by which the younger siblings of the monarch and the younger siblings of the monarch in waiting, they have jobs, they live ordinary, what we would say to a degree ordinary lives, and they combine them with royal duties, which I think is the future for the monarchy as we are. We cannot, I think, expect Charlotte and Louis to always be backup royals to Prince George, and of course this is what Harry and Meghan wanted and were denied, and I think that system is going to be the future. And the European royals also have smaller and fewer palaces, and I think that's probably the way we are going over history. But we're not going to see a situation where the palaces are knocked down and turned into offices. They are always going to be valued and treasured as historic monuments. But I think that the way in which they are parts of Monarchy HQ, I think, will be changed more and more. The Queen had a calendar of using her palaces. It was Buckingham Palace, it was Windsor, it was Sandringham at Christmas, and it was Balmoral in the summer, and her system was the same throughout her reign. I don't see yet that Charles is going to do exactly the same system. I think he has his own space and he enjoys Highgrove. I mean, Charles, unlike quite a few monarchs, bought his palace that he liked best before he became a monarch. And certainly we see William, I think, living in a smaller cottage, in Adelaide Cottage, and perhaps that's the way that we will continue in the future. And if we see a slimmed down monarchy, which I think that's what public opinion wants, and I think the monarchy has to change with the times, I think that palaces will become much more museums, stately homes, as opposed to places where the royal family live, exist and reign.